Ken Quinn from the Convention of States. Thank you, sir.
I've got some big shoes I got to fill here. I don't know if I came prepared. What I'm going to do is ask you, because I'm going to need you to look at the PowerPoint. So can I just walk over there? Can you all see the screen? And Caleb, can you plug in my laptop? So you might want to turn your chairs a little bit. My name is Ken Quinn. I am the Regional Director for the Convention of States Project. And I want to thank Caleb and Isaac for inviting me to come to your convention. I am so encouraged to see young people like these two standing for this. This is incredible for the Constitution. So it's an honor. I got to tell you, I did not become engaged until 2010. You know, I always voted, but I never got involved until the Tea Party movement took off, and that's when I marched. Did any of you march down to D.C. on 9/12? Were you at that event? Close to 1 million people were in Washington, D.C. I went to that. My wife and I went down there, and when I came back, I went to the first Tea Party event up in Augusta, Maine. Somebody handed me a pocket Constitution. I had never read the Constitution before in my life. I read through it that evening. It doesn't take that long. And when I was done reading that Constitution, I looked at my wife and I said, oh my word, we are so far away from what the founders gave us. And that started a journey for me where I began to really not just read the Constitution, but study it, research it. I got very involved in local politics in Maine. I became a chairman of the GOP up there, helped tons of state reps and legislators win, and I worked for a congressional campaign. I ended up working on Governor LePage's campaign, and I did that for several years. And you know what? After a few years, I realized nothing in Washington, D.C. is changing. It doesn't matter what party is in power. Nothing is going to change. And when the Convention of States project, this began, this is a project that Michael Ferris and Mark Meckler began in 2013. It came out the same week that Mark Levin published his book, Liberty Amendments. Isn't that incredible? They had no idea the two were doing the book or the project. It came out the same week. When I heard about Convention of States, I initially opposed it because I always believed, because of the information that I received by certain groups, that this was a bad idea. How many of you have heard that this is a con? It could run away. Have any of you heard the runaway convention myth? Okay, I believed it. I believed it so much that I used to hand out DVDs called Beware of Article 5 to legislators. And I would say, don't ever let this happen. It was dangerous. We will lose our Constitution. And what happened was when the Convention of States began, I started researching it, and it made me challenge, why was I against the Constitution? Why was I against the very tool the framers put in the Constitution to save our country? And I learned everything that I was being fed and taught about this was a complete and utter lie. It's not a con. It can't run away. And once the light went off for me, because what I did, I started reading the Federalist Papers. I went back to the notes that James Madison took at the 1787 convention. I never knew why they put it in there. And I'm going to share that with you today. And I think you, along with me, will realize this is a mechanism that we have got to use. How many of you, raise your hand, how many of you think the federal government is out of control? Raise your hand. How many of you think we're losing our freedoms on a pretty regular basis? Okay, that's the majority of this room. Now, how many of you really think elections are going to make a difference? Raise your hands. Okay, some. We need to elect good people to office, correct? And that's pretty much all we've ever done. But that is not the only check that we have. We, the people, have a check through our state legislators, and there's a number of you here today. I want to thank you for coming to this. And I want to, Representative Scott Wallace, if you don't mind standing up, because Representative Scott Wallace is the sponsor of our Article 5 application that I'll be sharing with you here shortly. And I want to thank you for your support for that. And I'm sure we can answer some questions for you afterwards. But I want to share with you some screenshots here. So the gentleman behind this, as I mentioned, was Mark Meckler. He, along with Michael Ferris, began this. Mr. Ferris is now with the Alliance Defending Freedom, religious freedom. But we now have former Senator Tom Coburn, and Jim DeMint just joined us a few weeks ago. These are two great patriots. All three of these are great patriots. And these two gentlemen on the right, they actually left Congress because they realized they couldn't make a difference. And so now they're working for us, for the Convention of States project. So it's an honor to be able to work with these gentlemen. What I want to do is I want to take you back to the 1787 convention. Okay, so let's go back to the future here. And as you all know, the convention began in May, and most of the delegates were arriving. And if you notice the date here, on May 29th, Edmund Randolph, who was the governor of Virginia, presented the Virginia Plan. And Resolution 13 stated that provision ought to be made for the amendment of the Articles of Union whensoever it shall seem necessary, and that the assent of the national legislature, or what we call Congress, ought not to be required thereto. Why do you think it was important for them to amend the Constitution without the assent or consent from Congress?
So you can have the people's will.
What's that?
You can have the people's will as opposed to Congress.
The people's will, correct. It was also, they're creating a government. Yes, Representative.
Because Congress reload ever giving people power back.
That's right. Because they were creating a government, and they wanted to be able to check the power of that government without its authority or approval. Exactly. It was a check. There are so many checks. One of the greatest things about our Constitution are the number of checks and balances between the branches. Now, many of those have been eroded or aren't even being used today. Article 5 is the ultimate check against a runaway federal government that we, the people, can exercise outside of just elections. This is so powerful. This can transform our nation. As we head down to the month of June, on June 11th, George Mason from Virginia, he said this: it would be improper to require the consent of the national legislature because they may abuse their power and refuse consent. Was he correct? These guys were geniuses. I never understood this when I was opposing this idea. Okay, so they went in there knowing they wanted to be able to amend it without the consent of Congress. Now, on September 15th, this is when the Constitution was basically agreed upon. It was signed 2 days later. Now, the original wording of Article 5 was incorrect. It read this way, quote, "The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem necessary, or on the application of 2/3 of the legislatures of the several states, shall propose amendments to this Constitution." And this is when George Mason stood up, and he thought the plan of amending the Constitution exceptional and dangerous. Exceptional means objectionable, as the proposing of amendments is in both the modes to depend, in the first immediately, in the second ultimately on Congress. No amendments of the proper kind would ever be obtained by the people if the government should become oppressive. And immediately after he made that statement, Gouverneur Morris and Elbridge Gerry both made the motion, and they moved to amend the article so as to require a convention of the application of 2/3 of the states. Okay, that was voted unanimously by the delegates. It was a way that they could bypass Congress, not leave any of it up to Congress. Because previously to this, Congress would propose it if 2/3 applied. He said, no, that's not good enough. What if they don't? And so they left the whole process up to the states. So now we have Article 5 today. This is how it's written. I'm just going to read the first two sections. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments. Notice it's a convention for what? Is it a constitutional convention to adopt a new constitution? No. It's for proposing amendments. That's all it is. It's only a recommendatory body. It can only propose ideas, solutions. It can't amend the Constitution. Now, I'm going to be here tomorrow because there's a meeting tomorrow, and there's going to be a speaker there completely saying this is not true. They're going to be opposing Article 5 and saying things that it's not. And they'll use the term con-con. Now, the framers were very specific about a constitutional convention versus a Article 5 convention. And you can read this in Federalist 85. A much higher bar, unanimous consent is required for a true con-con, and this is not that. Let me go on. Okay, so which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution. Obviously, amendments would be proposed to this Constitution, not a new one, when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states or by conventions in 3/4 thereof, as the one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by Congress. So Congress only has two ministerial duties in this entire process. They must call it once they receive applications by 2/3, or today that would be 34 states, whatever the topic, so the 2/3 of states have to agree on a topic or a subject or an amendment, okay? Once they call it, the rest of it is all up to the states. It's the rules, the choosing of delegates, the voting is all up to the states. And then the only other thing Congress has to do with this is they will determine whether it's ratified by the state legislatures or state conventions. And both of these processes have been used. In fact, the original Constitution was not ratified by state legislatures. It was ratified by the people in state conventions. All of our amendments, we have 27 amendments. All of them have been ratified by the legislatures except for one. Does anybody know which amendment was not ratified by our legislatures? Anybody? Take a guess.
Income tax?
No, it's the 21st Amendment repealing prohibition. Okay? So both of these processes have been used. This is not rocket science. This is something we have a long history of utilizing. Here's a great quote by Alexander Hamilton in regards to Article 5. Quote, by the 5th article of the plan, the Congress will be obliged, quote, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the states, which at present amount to 9, to call a convention for proposing amendments. The words of this article are peremptory. The Congress shall call a convention. Nothing in this particular is left to the discretion of that body. That's pretty clear, isn't it? Words have meanings, don't they? Nothing is left to the discretion of Congress. We may safely rely on the disposition of the legislatures to erect barriers against the encroachments of the national authority. And there's a little typo there. So the purpose of Article 5 in the convention mode was to protect the states from an encroaching federal government. That was the main reason they put it in there. They also wrote afterwards, you know, this is a way that the states can help adjust things that they see that need to be corrected. But it was mainly to protect the states. Now, John Dickinson at the convention, I love this quote, experience must be our only guide. Reason may mislead us. I love this quote because you're going to hear all kinds of stories of how this is such a bad idea. What I want to share with you today is let's look at our history. Let's look at our experience in regards to conventions. And I think you'll agree with me that this is not only something that we can handle as a nation, but we must utilize in order to save the republic that the framers gave us. Okay? So let's take a look at our history. And most people, including myself, I was not aware of this history. It's phenomenal. Here's a listing of 38 conventions of states that have been held in our, either through the interstate colonies or the states in our history. So beginning in 1677, see, this is how the colonies and the states dealt with issues. They would meet in a convention. The legislatures or the governing body of that state would send delegates. And they would deal with issues. A lot of these had to do with trade issues, defense issues, commerce issues. Now notice, if you look at the Annapolis, have any of you heard of the Annapolis Convention? That's a very important, that is how we came to have our Constitution, because it was the Convention of States held in Annapolis in 1786 that was called by Virginia to deal with commerce and trade issues. Only 5 states sent delegates, And what the delegates at that convention said, it was actually began on September 11th, 1786. They said this, basically, not enough states were present or a quorum, so they couldn't conduct business. And they said, next year in May in Philadelphia, we need to meet to take whatever means necessary to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union. They had a recommendation that we have to take whatever means necessary to save this country. Immediately after Annapolis, Virginia called. How many of you have heard that Congress called the 1787 convention to solely revise the Articles of Confederation? Have you heard that story? That is not true. Virginia called the convention in the month of October 1786 based on the recommendation that came out of the Annapolis Convention. It's amazing history. You could read it. 7 states followed Virginia's call and commissioned delegates to go to that. It wasn't until the next year, I think it was 5 months later, that Congress issued their opinion. And their opinion was, yes, basically it was just an endorsement of the convention that was already called by Virginia. We recommend that you go, we recommend, or it's our opinion, that you solely revise the Articles of Confederation. Okay? Only 2 states limited their delegates to solely revising the Articles, New York and Massachusetts. All the others gave their delegations full authority to do exactly what they did. It was not a runaway convention. In fact, the delegation from New York left. They didn't even sign. You see Alexander Hamilton's signature on your pocket Constitution. His vote, it didn't count because New York didn't have a quorum. And the Massachusetts delegates who stayed and signed it, 2 of them, even their very own legislature that commissioned them voted on whether or not they exceeded their authority in the legislature, and they rejected that idea. So this whole idea of a runaway convention is based on a straw man argument. It's based on a false understanding of our own history. Tomorrow I'm going to hear this story that we can't do this because it might run away like the last one. What a runaway story. Okay, so it ran away and we got the Constitution out of it. Hello? Does that make any sense? It boggles the mind. It boggles the mind. Now, I love this history. There's 2 other conventions here. The Hartford Convention. Now, I mentioned all these were called based on other issues, but we've had 2 now these are not Article 5 conventions, but these 2 conventions, Hartford in 1814 and Washington, D.C., 1861, were convention of states to propose amendments to the U.S. Constitution. The 1814 was a regional one here in the Northeast. 5 states met. It had to do with opposition to the War of 1812. However, in 1861, what was happening in our nation? Civil War was on the brink, right? Virginia again called a convention of states to propose amendments to the Constitution to try to prevent the Civil War from breaking out. 21 states sent delegates. New Hampshire. Do you guys know a guy named Amos Tuck by any chance? He was one of your delegates. It was in February of 1861. They met for 3 weeks. Lincoln had been elected, not in office yet. They actually passed an amendment at this convention. And because it was not in Article 5, they couldn't propose it back to the states because they didn't reach the 2/3 application. And so only 3 states applied ahead of time. So what they did was, John Tyler, he used to be president. He was the president of this convention. He delivered that amendment to Congress to have Congress propose it and then to pass it and then have it proposed to the states. And what happened? Congress sat on it like Congress usually does, and the war broke out shortly thereafter. But this process works. The country was completely divided, more than it is today. The states sent delegates. They debated, and they actually produced an amendment out of this. So to think that this cannot work today is just, you're being driven by fear. We need fearless leaders to use the Constitution the way the framers intended, and we can do this, folks. We can change the course of our nation. Now, I love to talk about state. You have the state constitutions here, right? You guys are awesome. You're just awesome because this is really neat history, state constitutions. Let me share with you some facts about states. Now, the only difference between a constitutional convention in a state is that they're going to adopt a constitution just for their state, correct? Right? There's been 233 conventions held in the states. Out of those, 146 constitutions have been adopted. Out of those, also 12,000 amendments. Now, not all the amendments came out of the conventions. Some came out of legislatures. But 12,000 amendments have been ratified to these state constitutions. Okay? New Hampshire has held the most conventions. Did you know that? You've held 17 constitutional conventions or conventions for proposing amendments. Actually, you've held 2 constitutional conventions to adopt a new constitution and 15 amendment conventions. You have adopted, all of those amendments came, I believe, because the only way to amend your constitution up until I think 1984 was through the convention process. 289 amendments were proposed and the people ratified 145. You need to be the state leading this because you have the most experience on conventions. The last one was what, 1984, I believe. Okay? So that's kind of cool history for you guys here in New Hampshire. And this just shows you the history on that. So you had 2 constitutional conventions, 1776 and 1784, and the rest were amendment conventions. This is something unique I never knew, and most of you probably don't either. But did you know there's a convention of states held every single year? Your state sends commissioners. Most of them are usually appointed by the governor. They meet for a week. Last year, I attended it in Vermont. They're not proposing amendments to the Constitution. What they're doing is they're drafting and proposing uniform state laws. It's known as the National Conference of Commissioners on Uniform State Laws, or commonly called the Uniform Law Commission. It works identical to an Article 5 convention. The delegates attend it for a week. They draft, debate, and propose uniform state laws. It's one state, one vote, just like an Article 5 convention would be. Whatever passes out of this conference or convention then is brought back to the state legislatures to be adopted as state law. Now, New Hampshire this year is looking at 2 acts that came out of this body this year to adopt as state law. Did you know that? So that mirrors the ratification process. This has been going on since 1892. 1892, a convention of states held every year. This year's is in San Diego. Folks, what has our experience been with conventions of states? Overwhelmingly positive. If anything's going to run away, it would be this thing, right? Because only one state has to adopt it. Nothing crazy. We haven't lost a republic in any of our states. They all have the Republican form of government, right? You've probably heard of the Uniform Law Commission. That came out of this body. All right, great. Go to uniformlaws.org. You can look up who your commissioners are for your state. You can look up what acts your state is currently looking at to adopt. And folks, this is our experience. This is nothing to be afraid of. We do this every single year. And that's an article that shows you all the same points as an Article 5 convention. It's amazing. Did you know we actually have 2 constitutions? Did you know that? Do any of you believe that? Let me share this.
People like us, the people that are frustrated in Washington, D.C., often say, well, they don't follow the Constitution anyway. Not true. They follow the wrong one. They're following the Constitution as interpreted by the Supreme Court, rather than the Constitution as written. This, taken out of my pocket, is a pocket Constitution. 4,000 words in the original document, 400 words. If you count the amendments, we're talking about 7,000 words. But here is the Constitution in force today. This is 3,000 pages of Supreme Court rulings showing what every rule has done to the original words. This isn't going to get any smaller. In fact, every time they publish this document, they leave a bunch of blank pages at the back for additional rulings that they know are coming. Every page in this document means a grant of power to the federal
That is the experience that we live under, that Constitution. You can actually go to the website and download that. It's pretty interesting. Michael Ferris is not the first person who said we had two constitutions. You know who the first person that said it was? James Madison. This blew me away. Quote, consider for a moment the immeasurable difference between the Constitution limited in its powers to enumerate objects and expounded upon as it would be by the import claimed for the phraseology in question. The difference is equivalent to two constitutions of characters essentially contrasted with each other, the one possessing powers confined to certain specified cases, that's the written one, the other extended to all cases whatsoever. You see, James Madison saw how the Constitution, the wording, Isaac, you mentioned how words make a difference, and we need to take a literal interpretation of words. He saw, in fact, I'll share with you, he saw the danger of the General Welfare Clause. Look at this. Quote, but while the terms common defense and general welfare remain in the Constitution unguarded against the construction which has been contended for, a fund of power, inexhaustible and wholly subversive of the equilibrium between the general and the state governments, is within the reach of the former. Why then not proceed all other amendments by one, expunging the phrase which is not required for any harmless meaning, or making it harmless by annexing to it the terms, quote, in the cases required by this Constitution. You see, he wanted to amend the Constitution because he saw how the general welfare was going to be just expanded upon. And most of our problems today have to deal with the interpretation of the General Welfare Clause and the Commerce Clause. All money that we see going to the federal government is because of the General Welfare Clause. All regulations that we see hurting our economy, our businesses, is the Commerce Clause. Commerce is this. When we go back, like Isaac said, to what did the words mean? Commerce meant shipping. The framers gave the federal government the authority to regulate interstate commerce, which meant shipping of product from one state to another state. They could regulate that to make sure things were regular and, states weren't taking advantage. That's all it meant. Shipping. Does that mean that today? It means virtually anything a business does. Health insurance. In fact, Obamacare was first pitched to be under the Commerce Clause, but then they whacked us with it as being a tax, right? So part of our goal, the Convention of States, is to do exactly what James Madison recommended. We want to redefine the terms general welfare and commerce so they cannot be expanded upon. Thank you. All right, I'm going to have to go through here pretty quick. Here's a question we get all the time. Congress already doesn't obey the Constitution. What makes you think they will by adding amendments to it? Good question, right? Well, I already showed you they do obey the Constitution as interpreted. But let me ask you this. Do you pay income tax? Why is that? The 16th Amendment, right? Because of the 16th Amendment. Do you vote for your senators? Right? That's an amendment. Is the president limited to 2 terms? That's an amendment. Do 18-year-olds get to vote? Women get to vote everywhere? Amendments work. The amendment process works. And so what we're trying to do is, let me get to where we need to go. These are the reasons why the framers put this process in the Constitution: to correct drafting errors, resolve constitutional disputes, reverse bad Supreme Court decisions. There's 4 amendments to our Constitution that have reversed bad Supreme Court decisions. Are there any bad Supreme Court decisions you'd like to see reversed? No. We can do it through this process. Respond to change conditions and correct and forestall governmental abuse. All of those have been used through the amendment process and solved through this process. So, did you know, I love to ask this question, how many amendments have been introduced by Congress since 1789? Take a guess. Just introduced, not passed, just thrown out there to discuss, debate, sent to a committee? More than that. Give me some big numbers. Now, I told you this answer the other day. Approximately 12,000 amendments have been introduced in Congress since 1789. 12,000, roughly 200 every Congress. Out of the 12,000, 33 have been passed and proposed to the states for ratification, and only 27 of those have been ratified. Okay? Take a guess how many amendments under Article 5 the states have introduced. 0. A big goose egg. Do you see what the problem could be? If the federal government's expanding all of its power and the states have the authority to rein it in and they've never gotten a chance to get up to bat, all we're asking for through this process is to have the same opportunity Congress takes advantage of every single year. Okay, they've done it 12,000 times. Now, here's a brief history. The reason an Article 5 convention has never been called, we've had over 400 applications. That's a lot more than 2/3, right? Why hasn't it been called? Because it's limited. The states have to agree on the subject. Here are some great, these are some of the application topics. There's some great amendments here. Now, the ones in yellow, the ones that are current this year, like the balanced budget, they're up to 27 states. They've been at it since 1975. Campaign finance reform, that's more on the left side of the political spectrum. They're trying to overturn Citizens United. They're up to 5 states. We're now up to 12, so I got to update this. And I'll share with you what we're trying to accomplish. So our experience on the federal government does look like this. There's our federal government in 1789. The amendments, the Bill of Rights were proposed when it was only 6 months old. Those are the only amendments that limit the power of the federal government are the Bill of Rights. Okay? Back then it worked great, but that cute little baby eagle is now a monster today, and so we need amendments to rein in this monster. That's what we're trying to accomplish. And so we see 4 major areas. We have the spending and debt crisis, the regulatory crisis, congressional attacks on state sovereignty, and the federal takeover of the decision-making process. Our application is designed to address all those 4 issues. I want to how many of you like the 10th Amendment? Why is that? The people in the states, right? Did you know that originally the 10th Amendment had a lot more words to it? Originally, Madison wrote this. This was what he proposed. The powers delegated by this Constitution are appropriated to the departments to which they are respectively distributed, so that the legislative department shall never exercise the powers vested in the executive, or the judicial, nor the executive exercise the powers vested in the legislative or judicial, nor the judicial exercise the powers vested in the legislative or the executive departments. He wanted those boundaries between departments clearly defined. The very first Congress removed that. Gee, I wonder why. All we have now for the 10th Amendment is the last sentence. So what we're trying to do is reestablish the checks and balances to the Constitution, mainly vertical between the states and the federal government. This is our application. We're not advocating specific amendments. We're advocating 3 subjects: imposing fiscal restraints on the federal government, limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and term limits on federal officials and members of Congress. So that would include the Supreme Courts. So any amendment that would fall under one of those 3 categories would be germane to our convention. So a balanced budget, for instance, these are some amendments that we could actually have introduced. A balanced budget, redefining the 2 clauses I spoke about earlier. Wouldn't it be nice to give the states the ability to overturn any executive order, federal law, or Supreme Court ruling if, say, 2/3 agreed? We could actually make that an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Sound like a good idea? So I need your help. We need to grow this grassroots effort in New Hampshire. We need to pass this Article 5 application next year in New Hampshire. We're up to 12 states now. We have to get to 34. New Hampshire is one of our targeted states to get this done in 2017. But we have some issues. We have some folks in leadership in your state that aren't very open to this idea. So we need to convince them. We need to change their mind. And I could use your help by, if you want to become a volunteer for us, please talk to me. I've got a petition out back if you would want to sign that. And please get involved. This is how we, the people, can actually use the authority of the Constitution to save our nation. And if you want to text petition to that number, you will get a link to sign our petition. So I want to thank you for your time, and I'll be here the rest of the day if you have any questions for me. Thank you. You're a good audience.